complexity in portfolio construction is mostly a story we tell ourselves to feel less anxious about not knowing the future. It does not, on average, improve our returns. It mostly improves our feelings about our returns, which is a different thing. Simple feels insufficient. Simple is almost always the right answer. Hello, friends. This is Tyler Gardner welcoming you to another episode of your Money Guide on the Side, where it is my job to simplify what seems complex, add nuance to what seems simple, and learn from and alongside some of the brightest minds in money, finance, and investing. So let's get started and get you one step closer to where you need to be. Quick note before we dive in. July's pre-order incentive for my book, Real Wealth, is live, and this one is for the investors who are ready to go beyond the basics. Pre-order this month, tell me you did at tylergardner.com/book, and I'll send you Investing 2.0, Beyond the Foundation, a full-hour video presentation on the 5 things every investor needs to know after they've mastered the fundamentals. Yours to keep, delivered to your inbox digitally in early August. And if you pre-order now, you're locked in for every monthly incentive through December 1st. tylergardner.com/book. Now let's get into it. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you, as always, for choosing to spend some time thinking about money with me, which has, over the past several months, started to feel less like a podcast and more like a really cool, long, ongoing conversation, which I happen to like way more than just the solo podcast. Today, we're going to go back to a topic we visited on a few occasions, because you all continue to ask some great questions about the details on this one. A few months ago, I did an episode on how I would handle a $2 million portfolio in retirement. The 90-10 split, the withdrawal math, the framework for not running out of money. That episode, against a lot of my expectations, became the most listened to thing I've put out since starting the show about a year and a half ago. Now, I covered the funds I would use in that original episode, but only briefly, kind of somewhere in the middle, in a way that flew past some listeners. And in the months since, the most consistent feedback I've gotten has been some version of, Tyler, that was a great episode, but I want to slow down and actually understand the allocation piece. What goes where and why, and legitimately, what is the difference between using 2 funds versus 3 funds versus 5 funds? Additionally, this is going to serve as a reminder episode and answer to the following question. Shouldn't my portfolio be more complex than just 2 or 3 funds? To which the answer is always and forever, unequivocally, no. So today's the deep dive. And if you listen to the original $2 million episode, parts of this are going to feel like review. You've heard me reference VTI and a money market fund before. Stay with me anyway, because we're going to go several layers deeper than I went the first time. We're going to walk through legitimate ways to allocate the $2 million, a 2-fund version, a 3-fund version, and a 5-fund version. But then we're also going to cover some actual mechanics, what each fund does, why bond funds and money market funds are fundamentally different instruments, and where the marketing version of diversification stops matching the mathematical version. And we're going to be honest about which version is actually going to be right for most people. So, if you didn't listen to the original episode, yes, this one will stand on its own. You don't need the prerequisite, but you still might want to go back and check it out, as it offers a foundational framework for all of us. And a small but crucial disclaimer before we start, since I do this every time I get into the specifics, I am not your financial advisor. I am a former financial advisor and licensed portfolio manager who's now a guy walking through the woods of Vermont talking into a phone. This is not personalized advice. For the application to your specific situation, whether it's your tax bracket info, your other income, your timeline, your spouse, your health, the 40 billion other variables that actually matter, please work with a CPA or a CFP who knows your numbers and your goals. Today is the framework that you can use to learn more about what works for you, but this is not a substitute to your doing the deep work on your own. It's a complement. And familiar ask before we get into it, if this show has ever been useful to you, A review on Apple or Spotify is the single best thing you can do for it. It is genuinely how the show finds new listeners, and it is how I know that this entire endeavor is reaching someone besides the deer currently standing in my front yard as I record this episode at 6 a.m. on an early Vermont summer morning. All right, $2 million, 3 options, let's get into it. First, a quick grounding why the number of funds matters much less than you think it does. Before we get into the 3 options, I want to plant a flag that the rest of the episode is going to circle back to. The single most important variable in your investing life is not which funds you pick. It is the difference between being invested and not being invested. The second most important variable is the difference between low costs versus high costs. The third is whether you stay invested through downturns. The fourth is your savings rate. But the number of funds you hold or which specific funds, that's somewhere around the 8th or 9th most important variable, possibly lower. So if you have to go right now and you can only internalize one message, make it this. The difference between your choosing VTI versus VOO, or a bond fund versus a money market fund at the end of your investing journey means, for all intents and purposes, to put it as scientifically as I can, zilch. And, as you all know, most personal finance content treats fund selection as if it were the central question. It's not the central question. It is, in fact, one of the smaller questions in the hierarchy of decisions you will make about your money. But the reason it gets so much attention is that it's the easiest to hang on to because the math is concrete, the comparisons are clean, and the answers are satisfying in a way that save more and don't panic simply is not. And when I started creating short form content focusing on actual fund names, those videos exploded in popularity because everyone believes there's just a fund out there that will solve all of your problems. Not even close. So if the core question for so many of us is, okay, Tyler, then what do I need to know and how can I achieve my financial goals? Well, sit back and relax as I'm going to give you 3 good answers today. All 3 of them are legitimate. All 3 of them, if executed well over 30 years, will produce outcomes that are within a hair's breadth of each other. The differences in returns between a well-built 2-fund portfolio and a well-built 5-fund portfolio over the long run are small enough that they are dwarfed by the difference between someone who panic sold in March 2020 and someone who didn't. That's the crucial context you need. Now let's talk about the funds. Option 1, the 2-fund portfolio. The simplest legitimate portfolio you can build holds 2 funds. That's it. 2. The classic version is a VTI plus BND. VTI is Vanguard's total stock market ETF. It holds essentially every publicly traded U.S. company weighted by size. BND is Vanguard's total bond market ETF. It holds a broad mix of U.S. investment-grade bonds. Together, those 2 funds give you exposure to roughly 4,000 stocks and 10,000 bonds for a combined expense ratio of about 0.03%, 3 basis points, the cheapest professional money management you have ever paid for by an enormous margin. Now, the allocation between them is the first decision, meaning if I had $2 million, what percentage would I put in VTI versus what percentage would I put in BND? For an accumulation phase investor, or as you know how much I hate investing based on age, for anyone who doesn't need that money for 10 years, the standard answer is 100% in VTI or 90% VTI and 10% BND. For someone in retirement, the answer is much more dependent on cash flow needs and risk tolerance, and anywhere from the textbook 60-40 stocks bonds to 90-10 is defensible. As you know, I will always lean heavier stocks because I fear inflation and interest rate risk much more than I fear a decade of zero returns on equities. But there's a second flavor of the 2-fund portfolio that I want to spend some real time on because it's the one I used in the original $2 million episode and it led to some great follow-up questions. It is also the allocation I currently use with my own money at 43 years old. That version is VTI, or another total stock market fund or S&P 500 fund, tomato, tomato, plus a money market fund instead of a bond fund. And these are different things, and the difference matters. Here's the cleanest way I can explain it. This episode is brought to you by Fabric by Gerber Life. I have insurance on my truck, my house, my phone, and at one point, I hate to admit, a $40 toaster. You probably do too, because many of us insure the stuff without blinking and then completely skip ensuring the one thing our families actually depend on, which is us. That's not a small oversight. That's protecting the toaster and not the people we love. If that hits a little close to home, here's your fix. Fabric by Gerber Life is term life insurance you can get done today. Made for busy parents like you, all online, on your schedule, right from your couch. You could be covered in 10 minutes, often with no health exam required. And if you're young and healthy, now is when you lock in low rates. We're talking $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day. If you've got coverage through work, that's a great start, but it may fall short of what your family needs, and it can disappear when you change jobs. Fabric follows you. Plus, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. You can cancel anytime, so there's genuinely no risk to finding out. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/Tyler, meetfabric.com/Tyler, and use my link so they know I sent you. meetfabric.com/Tyler. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company, not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. This episode is brought to you by LMNT. Heading into the summer, LMNT just dropped what is essentially their version of an Arnold Palmer, lemonade iced tea, and I currently have a full pitcher of it sitting in my fridge. A little caffeine alongside the salt and electrolytes is exactly what I want after a long walk through the woods with the bloodhounds, or in the late afternoon when I'd otherwise be reaching for a second cup of coffee that I don't actually need. But here's what makes this different from other energy drinks. Most energy drinks use synthetic, isolated caffeine. LMNT uses full-spectrum, organic black tea extract from Kericho, Kenya, 7,000 feet of elevation, so the caffeine comes with its naturally occurring L-theanine and polyphenols. The result is steadier energy, less spike, less crash, and only 50 milligrams of caffeine per serving. Enough to matter, not enough to regret. Head to drinkelement.com/Tyler, become an LMNT insider, and you'll get 4 boxes for the price of 3. That's drinklmnt.com/Tyler, and even though I love this new flavor, this does nothing to diminish my feelings about mango chili and watermelon salt. A bond fund like BND holds bonds of varying maturities, typically 1 to 30 years. The price of a bond fund moves up and down based on interest rates, credit risk, and market sentiment. When interest rates rise, the price of a bond fund falls, sometimes meaningfully, because that fund is holding a bunch of bonds that now have lower interest rates compared to the newly issued higher interest rates. In 2022, BND lost about 13% in a single year, which was the worst year for bonds in modern memory, and which surprised a lot of people who had been told their entire lives that bonds were the safe part of the portfolio. Bond funds are generally less volatile than stocks, but they are not immune to losses, and in certain interest rate environments, they can lose real money. A money market fund, on the other hand, like Vanguard's VMFXX, or Schwab's SWVXX, or Fidelity's SPRXX. They hold extremely short-term debt, mostly U.S. Treasury bills and high-quality corporate paper, with maturities measured in days or weeks. Money market funds aim to maintain a stable share price of $1, and the risk of losing principal is, for all practical purposes, 0. They yield whatever short-term treasury rates are doing, currently around 3.5% at the time of this recording, and the yield moves up and down with the Federal Reserve's rate decisions. But the principle does not move. Money market funds are not technically guaranteed by the FDIC the way some bank deposits are, but they are in practice about as safe as cash gets. So the meaningful question when someone hands you the two-fund portfolio is, do you want bonds or do you want a money market as your risk-off component? Here's some general guidance. If you're in retirement and your bond allocation is meant to be the part you spend from in the next several years, a money market fund is, I would argue, a much cleaner instrument for that job than a bond fund. The job of the conservative side of your portfolio in retirement is to be there, predictably when you need it, at a value that you know. A money market fund delivers that. A bond fund in a bad year might not. Now, if you're in accumulation phase and your bond allocation is meant to dampen volatility and rebalance against stocks over decades, then a bond fund is a more standard tool because over long periods, the bond fund's slightly higher yield compounds in a way that matters. But for an investor who is genuinely just looking for a safe place to park the conservative side of the portfolio, money market tends to be the cleaner answer. In the original $2 million episode, my retiree had 90% in stocks and 10% in a money market, about $200,000 sitting in a money market fund generating 3 to 4% on its own, available immediately if needed, with essentially zero principal risk. That structure works in a way that 90% stocks plus 10% bonds would not, because BND can lose 10 or 15% in a bad bond year, and the whole point of the conservative slice was to be there when stocks fell and you needed cash. So, the two-fund portfolio, VTI plus BND if you want bonds, VTI plus a money market if you want true cash. Both legitimate, choose based on what the conservative slice is for, and ignore, please, anyone who tells you that two funds is not enough. It is, in fact, often plenty. Option 2, the three-fund portfolio, also known as the Boglehead portfolio. This is the most famous portfolio in personal finance, and the man associated with it is, interestingly, not Jack Bogle, but a man named Taylor Larimore. I want to spend a minute on Larimore because his story is genuinely lovely and because I think his portfolio represents the philosophical heart of what most retail investors should be doing. Again, not advice. Taylor Larimore is, depending on whose podcast you listen to, the king of the Bogleheads. He was born in 1924. You heard me correctly. He's 102 years old at the time of this recording. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge as a paratrooper. He's been a friend, advocate, and disciple of Bogle since roughly the founding of the index fund industry, and he has spent the better part of 4 decades evangelizing through books, through forum posts on the Bogleheads forum, through patient comments and debates for the idea that the typical retail investor should hold a small number of broad, low-cost index funds and stop trying to be clever. That right there, that's my kind of hero. Larimore's signature contribution to the world of investing is the three-fund portfolio: total U.S. stock market, total international stock market, and total bond market. 3 funds, that's it. And the argument's straightforward. Total U.S. covers every public American company. Total international covers every public company in the rest of the developed and emerging world. Total bond covers a wide swath of investment-grade U.S. bonds. Between them, you own a meaningful slice of almost every traded asset in the global market, weighted by size, for a combined expense ratio that is, again, around 3 to 7 basis points. The portfolio is automatically diversified, automatically self-cleansing as winners and losers cycle through the indexes, and requires almost zero maintenance beyond an annual rebalance. Now, here's a wrinkle that I find fascinating, and almost nobody I know tells this story correctly. John Bogle himself, the founder of Vanguard, the patron saint of indexing, the man who created the entire intellectual architecture that the three-fund portfolio is built on, he was famously skeptical of international investing. Bogle's argument, and perhaps this will sound familiar from my own inherited thoughts and learning, was that large American companies generate roughly half their revenue from overseas operations, and that holding a U.S. total market fund therefore gives you de facto global exposure without the additional volatility, currency risk, and lower long-term returns of holding international stock directly. He believed a domestic-heavy portfolio was perfectly sufficient. Larimore disagreed. Most of the modern Boglehead community disagrees. The standard advice has migrated toward including international, both for diversification reasons and because of academic research suggesting that home country bias is a behavioral mistake. But Bogle, until the end of his life, would tell you that the international slice was optional at best. And at the risk of alienating myself from the king of the Bogleheads himself, I too do not believe you need that international slice. Just Google iPhones sold in China in 2026, and you'll get where I'm going with this. This is one of those moments in personal finance where the high priests disagree. But allow me, as the equivalent of the acolyte in the room, to offer the honest answer that neither side is quite willing to admit. It doesn't matter very much, and it's not going to affect your long-term returns one way or another. A three-fund portfolio with international exposure, or a two-fund portfolio without it, will produce returns over 30 years that are within 1% or 2% of each other in either direction, depending on which decade you measure. Either is defensible. So if you find the international argument compelling, hold international. If you find Bogle's argument compelling, don't. The world will not end on either decision. I should also mention one name while we're on the subject, Rick Ferri, whose work I genuinely love and whose contribution to this conversation is a four-fund portfolio, sometimes called the Core Four: total U.S. stock market, total international stock market, total bond, and the addition of a REIT fund, or a real estate investment trust. Ferri's argument for adding REITs is that real estate is a genuinely distinct asset class from broad equities, with different drivers of return and meaningful diversification benefits at the margin. His work is rigorous, his books are excellent, and if you find yourself drawn to a slightly more diversified portfolio, his framework is one of the most thoughtful I have ever come across. So if you haven't read his work, and this episode in particular interests you, pick up a copy of All About Asset Allocation, as to date, it is the best practical guide I ever found, but it is also slightly technical for some 1.0 readers and listeners that I have heard from. But, and this is where the rest of the episode begins, hear me now, my friends. Once you start adding the fourth fund, you're entering a domain where the math gets a little fuzzier and the active bet starts to get larger, which brings us to option 3. This episode is brought to you by Copilot Money. I have a group chat with 4 of my closest friends from my finance days. Between us, decades of managing other people's money, multiple licenses, and an embarrassing amount of opinions about actively managed funds. These are not people who download budgeting apps. These are people who tend to mock budgeting apps. And yet, every single one of them uses Copilot Money. The group text now contains, between bond market commentary and Bills game updates, sincere love letters to a finance app. One texted last week, "I finally feel like my financial life is in one place." That's from a guy who manages 8-figure portfolios. Here's why people who actually know money land here. It tracks spending, net worth, investments, savings goals, and budgets in one dashboard. And it's beautiful to look at, which shouldn't matter, but does when you're building a habit. It auto-categorizes transactions, it tracks subscriptions, so you'll finally find the streaming service you forgot about and the gym membership you've been emotionally lying to yourself about since February. It works across iPhone, iPad, Mac, and web. And, best part, they don't sell your data. It's the only personal finance app to win an Apple Editor's Choice Award, an Apple Design Awards finalist, and it has 4.8 stars from over 28,000 reviews. So go to copilot.money/Tyler, use code Tyler2, that's Tyler and the number 2, for 2 free months. That's copilot.money/Tyler. This episode is brought to you by Bilt. You've heard me talk about Bilt as the loyalty program that lets you earn points on rent wherever you live, and they just leveled up even more. As of 2026, homeowners can also earn up to 1.25x points on their mortgage payments. This is thanks to Bilt's 3 new credit cards: the Palladium card, Obsidian card, and Blue card. All 3 turn your housing payments, rent, or mortgage into flexible rewards, so you can choose the card that fits your lifestyle without missing out on points and exclusive benefits. Bilt points can be redeemed at top airlines and hotels, Amazon.com purchases, future rent payments, and more. Bilt points have also been ranked by top publications as the industry's most valuable point currency. Your housing payment is already your biggest expense. Make it your most rewarding. Find the card that fits your lifestyle and apply it today at joinbilt.com/Tyler. That's joinbilt.com/Tyler, and make sure to use our URL so they know we sent you. Terms and limitations apply. Subject to approval and eligibility, Bilt cards are issued by Column NA, member FDIC, pursuant to license from MasterCard International Incorporated. Option 3. The 5-fund portfolio and why you probably shouldn't. All right, here's where I'm just going to be brutally honest. If you want to build a 5-fund portfolio, here is one reasonable version: total US stock, total international stock, total bond, REITs, and a small cap value tilt or a TIPS slice. That portfolio is fine. It's not bad. There are intelligent people who hold portfolios like this, and the academic case for each individual addition has a lot of merit. The small cap value tilt is rooted in the FAMA French research on size and value premiums. REITs offer genuine asset class diversification. TIPS protect against unexpected inflation in a way that nominal bonds do not. Note 2, TIPS are the one thing that Burton Malkiel recommended in that famous interview that I had with him and forgot to press record. He said lion's share should be in equities, and TIPS should serve as the fixed income component. That would be his ideal 2-fund play. But regardless of what you decide, I want to walk you through what is actually happening when you add fund number 4 and then fund number 5. Fund number 4 is, in most cases, an active bet that one specific asset class will outperform a total market portfolio. When you add REITs, you're essentially saying, I think real estate will outperform broad equities over my time horizon, or at the very least zig when stocks zag in a way that improves my risk-adjusted returns. That might be true. It also might not. Real estate has had decades of strong performance and decades of weak performance, and the premium over broad equities is not consistent. Fund number 5 is, almost without exception, a more aggressive version of the same bet. When you add small cap value, you're saying, I believe in the size and value premiums. I believe they will persist over my investing horizon, and I want to overweight them. That's what you're doing. It's like buying a tech fund and then buying NVIDIA shares additionally. That's an active position, and it's an active bet. It might pay off. Just know the data over the last 20 years suggests it has paid off less consistently than the academic literature suggested it would. And here's what so many folks don't tell you about adding another fund. The additional diversification benefit declines very quickly. Going from one fund, say an S&P 500 fund, to 2, adding international, is genuinely diversifying. Going from 2 to 3, we add bonds, is genuinely diversifying. Going from 3 to 4, adding REITs, gives you a small, debatable diversification benefit. Going from 4 to 5 is now adding what we would call a tilt, and that is mathematically mostly an active bet, and the marginal diversification per added fund collapses quickly. Meanwhile, The correlations between asset classes have shifted in important ways over the last 2 decades. Real estate, which was historically a meaningful diversifier from equities, has become far more correlated with broad stocks during stress periods. International stocks, which used to move somewhat independently of US stocks, now move basically in lockstep, particularly during global crises. Even the US stock and US bond correlation, which was reliably negative for decades, became positive during the 2022 inflation shock. Meaning, when stocks fell, bonds fell too, and the diversification you thought you had simply wasn't there. Now, this doesn't mean it won't be there in the next 20 years, but it does mean that more diversification, for diversification's sake, is not always a necessary play, and there's immense data to back that up. The honest takeaway from modern correlation data is that the additional diversification you get from adding funds number 4 and 5 is smaller than the marketing materials would suggest. And during the periods when you most need diversification, it is often the smallest. The funds you added to feel safer tend to move together when the market goes down. So, when I look at someone who's built a 5-fund portfolio because it feels more sophisticated, what I usually see is one of 2 things. The first is someone who has, often unknowingly, built a portfolio that is mostly the same as a 3-fund portfolio in terms of risk and return, with a slightly higher cost and a slightly more complicated rebalancing schedule. The active bets at the margin have been small enough not to matter much. The diversification benefits have been small enough not to matter much. And the result is essentially indistinguishable from what they would have had with 3 funds. The second is someone who has built a portfolio that has, at the margins, made meaningful active bets. Overweight to small cap value, overweight to international, overweight to REITs, and whose returns now diverge from a simple total market portfolio in ways they may or may not understand. Sometimes that will outperform, sometimes it will underperform. Either way, they are no longer indexing in the original Bogle sense. They are stock picking with sectors instead of stocks. Now, that's not necessarily bad. It's a choice. But what I want listeners to understand is that the move from 3 to 5 funds is, in the strictest sense, not a continuation of indexing philosophy. It is the introduction of active management dressed up as diversification. The simpler portfolios are pure index philosophy. The more complicated ones add layers of judgment that statistically do not reliably improve returns and that introduce real costs in the form of additional decisions, rebalancing complexity, and behavioral risk. So if you find yourself wanting to hold a 5-fund portfolio because you genuinely believe in the academic case for the size or value premium, do it knowingly and accept that you have made an active bet. That's fine. Investing is a game of judgment, and there's no shame in making a considered judgment. Personally, I hold growth funds, which are the same type of active bet. I believe that tech is simply going to be a better performer over the next 20 years than, say, industrials or consumer discretionary. Maybe I'm right. Maybe I'll get punished like many did in 2000. But I do know I'm making an active bet that is not at the core of basic indexing philosophy. Ultimately, if you find yourself wanting the 5-fund portfolio because 3 funds feels insufficient, because surely something so simple cannot possibly be right, please understand that this feeling is one of the oldest and most expensive feelings in finance. It's the feeling that has driven generations of retail investors into expensive funds, complex strategies, and ultimately worse outcomes than they would have had if they had simply held a broad market index and stopped tinkering. And in language some more of us might understand and appreciate, that 5th fund usually just serves as a gateway fund to more and more and more funds, and you wake up years from now staring at 63 funds and have no idea how they even are supposed to play together. Simple feels insufficient. Simple is almost always the right answer. A quick word on rebalancing. Whatever portfolio you end up with, 2 funds, 3 funds, 5 funds, You need to rebalance occasionally. That's the key word here. Not constantly, not weekly, once a year, ideally on the same date every year. You look at your allocation, and if any fund has drifted more than a few percentage points from its target, I usually suggest not moving anything unless 5% or more of a drift. You sell some of the winners and buy some of the losers to bring everything back into line. Rebalancing is one of the few free lunches in investing because it enforces sell high, buy low behavior automatically. And over decades, it produces a small but real return premium over a portfolio that is never rebalanced. It also has the secondary psychological benefit of forcing you to take actions that feel wrong, selling things that have done well, buying things that have done badly, which is exactly the discipline that distinguishes successful investors from unsuccessful ones. Rebalancing inside of tax-advantaged accounts, IRAs, 401ks, Roths, has no tax liabilities. Rebalancing inside a taxable brokerage account does potentially generate capital gains, so the tax-aware version is to do most of your rebalancing through new contributions, directing new money toward whichever fund is underweight rather than selling the overweight fund, and reserving outright rebalancing for the tax-advantaged side of your portfolio. This is one of those topics where the simpler your portfolio, the simpler the rebalancing. A 2-fund portfolio rebalances in about 30 seconds. A 5-fund portfolio rebalances in about 10 minutes. The complexity tax of more funds is real, even if it's small. So, 2 funds, 3 funds, 5 funds, 3 legitimate options, 3 reasonable answers. Here's what I want you to take from today's episode, beyond the specific tickers. The tickers are the easiest part. You can, in 5 minutes on Vanguard, Schwab, or Fidelity websites, build any of these portfolios. And that's an area where ChatGPT or Claude can help you, and you can do it in about 5 minutes. The work, however, is not in the selection. The work is in the discipline that follows. A 2-fund portfolio that you fund consistently, leave alone, and rebalance annually will outperform a beautifully constructed 5-fund portfolio that you tinker with, second guess, sell from in panic, or abandon when something shinier comes along. The behavioral tax of complexity is real, and it shows up in the form of decisions made at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. This is why Bogle was right about something more fundamental than the international debate. He used to say that the best portfolio is the one you can stick with through the worst markets. And the 2-fund portfolio is, by an enormous margin, the easiest one to stick with. There are fewer moving parts, fewer decisions, fewer opportunities to outsmart yourself. I am genuinely not telling you that simple is for beginners and complex is for sophisticates. The actual hierarchy, as I see it after 15 years of reading about this, writing about this, talking about this, is something closer to simple is for everyone, including the most sophisticated investors who have been honest enough with themselves to admit that they do not, in fact, know which way the market will move next year. And if Burton Malkiel doesn't know which way it's going, sorry, my friends, neither do we. Complexity in portfolio construction is mostly a story we tell ourselves to feel less anxious about not knowing the future. It does not, on average, improve our returns. It mostly improves our feelings about our returns, which is a different thing. So, if you want to be told you need 5 funds, there's no shortage of content creators happy to sell you a more complicated portfolio. Most of them have a financial incentive to do so because complexity is a product they can charge for. I have no such incentive, so I will tell you what the math actually shows. Hold a small number of broad, cheap funds, fund them consistently, ignore the noise, rebalance once a year, and stop trying to outsmart a market that has, for 100 years, paid an excellent return to people who just held the broad indexes and ignored the temptation to pick. Finally, if you've made it through 35 minutes of asset allocation talk on a podcast that last month was talking about Greek poetry, thank you. I appreciate the company, and if this gave you something to think about, please consider leaving a review on Apple or Spotify. It is genuinely how new listeners find the show, and it lets me know that there is in fact an audience out there for personal finance that occasionally takes the form of a Vermont woods walker telling you that the simple answer is usually right. I'll see you next week, and as always, hope this gives you something to think about throughout the week ahead. Thanks for tuning in to your Money Guide on the Side. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to visit my website at tylergardner.com for even more helpful resources and insights. And if you are interested in receiving some quick and actionable guidance each week, don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter, where each Sunday I share 3 actionable financial ideas to help you take control of your money and investments. You can find the sign-up link on my website, tylergardner.com, or on any of my socials at socialcapofficial. Until next time, I'm Tyler Gardner, your money guide on the side, and I truly hope this episode got you one step closer to where you need to be.